Go. All right, hello. This is the episode 7 of the Geoconservative Files. I am Mr. Geocon, and joining me today is MaxMaria, also known as Max D. Esme. Say hello, everybody.
Hey, everybody. I also go by Dean Esme, although actually nobody really calls me Dean anymore, even my wife. It's just a legal name I got some fame on. So there you go. Max is fine.
So, Max, tell me a little bit about yourself. What have you? What are you all about?
What am I all about? Well, these days, to be honest with you, these days I'm mostly concerned with getting ready for the coming year, which is going to be very difficult, and concentrating as much as I can on my relationship with God, family, and people near me. That said, I'm still out on the internet, kind of stirring up trouble because I like to do that, and hanging out with my buds in the Red Pill Religion Discord server. And I also do a weekly show once a week over at Gator and Frog, the Gator and Frog Network, with TC Rogue and David Nemo, some old men's rights buds, and we talk about conspiracy theories and the supernatural and stuff. He's an atheist friend. Well, TC's an atheist, and David's sort of agnostic in between, kind of a pagan-y kind of believer, and me, and we have a fun time talking about stuff. And so that's what I'm doing these days. I guess I could say, because I know you said you wanted to hear about my history, and I was a writer and activist on the internet going back. Actually, I've been on the internet, depending on how you look at these things, since the 80s, early 90s, well before it was popular anyway. And I used to manage forums on the old, on an old. People have still kind of heard of CompuServe. Well, I worked with a competitor of CompuServe, and I also called Genie, and GENIE, and I also, used to write for a few different computer publications. This again was back in the 80s and early 90s when computers were very new and revolutionary, and I was into computers and all that. Actually going back to the 70s, because I'm just that old, and I was a kid playing with this stuff. By the early 90s, I kind of wanted to get out of that, although I kind of kept getting back into it. I even worked for a while with Ian Murdoch, the guy who he's mostly forgotten, but he created Debian Linux. And Debian Linux and all of its, much of the Linux universe now owes a lot to Ian Murdoch for the entire way most Linux distros work. They're almost all based on some variety of Linux, or Debian. Not almost all, but just a ton of them. And that was an internet.com bubble burst startup I worked at. So I worked at one of those, and I'm an old IT guy, tech writer, project manager, technical trainer, all of that. That was who I was up from like the 70s to the late 70s, early 80s to the 90s. I started more and more writing. I started one of the world's very first blogs. It'll never be credited this way, but back when blogs were a big thing, I was one of the world's biggest bloggers. Before blogs were a big thing, I had one of the world's first blogs. I called it Dangerous Thoughts. I started it in 1999, and it was just like essays I wrote and put on the internet. I mean, I wasn't the only one doing it before that, but it was one of the first. And I really always just wanted to be a writer. I did not want to be a computer guy anymore. I had already been in the computer field for a long time, and I had drifted into being a writer and reporter in the computer field, which again was very different than today, but it was just, I liked the writing aspect and the learning about things and explaining things to people, training them, writing articles, covering the news in the industry, that sort of thing. But then I drifted into politics. By the way, I was born in '66, if anybody's keeping track. Again, this is who I was in the 80s, 90s. I started getting into politics. My politics, when I first became old enough to vote, I voted my first election in 1984 for Walter Mondale, the Democrat, at the age of 18. And since then, after that, I was more or less a lefty Democrat for any number, not that many years, but quite a few years. And then I flipped over and became a libertarian, and even a dues-paying member of the Libertarian Party in the early 90s. And actually, I did not give up on libertarianism until the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, I became a well-known political blogger not long after 9/11 hit. It was called Dean's World. I have a link to it here. I mean, we used to just publish quite a few articles a day. We had a stack of writers, some of whom have gone on to fame or are still famous, some of whom have disappeared. But I mean, we had writers on there like Joe Gandelman of the Moderate Voice, who used to write for the Christian Science Monitor, Celia Farber, who had written for Rolling Stone and Spin and Esquire, also was one of our writers for a while. Ron Coleman, who is a lawyer, a big hotshot lawyer, who recently argued and won a case before the Supreme Court, literally at the Supreme Court, on a censorship case regarding a music group calling itself The Slants. He literally got to argue before the Supreme Court and won a case. So that's like the thing. If you're a lawyer, you say you've done that. We had a lot of really interesting people. And I came over and tilted firmly into Republican territory as a writer and a political analysis covering the Iraq War, starting after 9/11. And my blog was called Dean's World. And if you go look at old pictures of it, it looks kind of plain, but that was the style of the day. Plus we ran really lean, and we didn't run a lot of ads, and we didn't do, we kept minimal. We mostly ran on donations. I was doing it mostly with my wife. I was also working full-time and while doing it at a regular day job. And in fact, at one time I was working full-time doing that blog to try to make a writing career and a blogging career happen, and also going to school full-time to get a degree. I eventually, collapsed from all of that in the late 2000s. But during that period, especially that golden zone from about 2003 to about 2005 to 6, Dean's World was in the top 100 of all the world's most influential blogs quite a few times, certainly in the top 200 most of the time. We got written up, we got papers written about us. An early paper, I think it was from Oxford, looked at us as one of the most influential blogs in the whole world at the time. And I was foursquare with President George W. Bush at the time. Anybody who's mad at me now, just remember this was a long time ago and I got lied to. But I covered the Iraq War, and I had been hesitant to go to the Iraq War. But what I saw as a political pundit at that time, because I was pretty famous, we got invited to Washington a few times. We got invited to the Republican National Convention and went. We were on a press conference call just for people like us with Tony. What's his name? He died. Is it Tony Snow? He was the White House press secretary. Anyway. We did a lot. We helped run a charity to help troops and in Iraq distribute food, distribute toys and medical supplies. We were helping run charities for children and soldiers in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We were contributors to all these. We weren't the main guys doing it, but we were big time pushing it and doing everything to help. So we were running charities. Literally at one point with this thing called Operation Give that nobody remembers, we literally had Federal Express giving us free shipping to Iraq just so we could ship toys and medical supplies to soldiers in Iraq to give to children and families there to try and forge friendships. One of the things that has always been forgotten, because we heavily covered that war. And I became more and more of a Republican partisan in those years because I kept seeing the way Democrats were lying about Bush. I'll say, looking back, I didn't see the way Bush was lying because I finally figured out that both sides lie a lot. Because both Democrats and Republicans lied constantly about the Iraq War and what they were doing. Bush lied, so did Democrats. And that was a pattern I started seeing more and more. So that by the late 2000s, I realized it's a game. Both parties lie about each other in the same ways, and they know they're doing it. But I was a political pundit and very influential in those days. We did charity work. We had some top drawer people, including some really famous, well-esteemed people now who were part of that. We had a lot of scientists who hung out. If you looked, we called it Defending the Liberal Tradition in History, Science, and Philosophy. That was our tagline for years. And because we had the attitude, is that you could bring anything. You could bring any position, you could bring any opinion, but you had to come correct. You had to come with reasons to, sources and defense for your argument. And we didn't put up with any BS, personal attacks. It was all about come correct. What is your argument? What is your data? What is your reasoning? Show it. And if you can, we'll do it. We'll talk about it. Nothing like that. Nothing works like that on the internet anymore, I don't think. But during these years, I covered. This was I covered and often worked with, not worked with, but wrote about the climate change issue, and how that was phony, because it is. It wasn't. None of it was my original work, but I promoted and studied both sides of the debate and came out firmly that it's obvious that the climate change, global warming science is garbage. I used to follow people like Steve McIntyre and Tony Heller and those. And, you put out names like that and you'll find their names are smeared all over the internet. But, no, it's clear that the climate change is garbage. And I even did work on, because science was always my favorite subject. So I always brought on scientists. We had a ton of scientists on, do guest pieces for us or come in and comment on a variety of topics, because I always liked, what are subjects that are not being covered, that are questionable in contemporary science? What are issues in contemporary science? What are things people have forgotten in science? Because that's a big problem. Science is my favorite subject. I didn't even know much about philosophy at the time. I thought I knew something, but I didn't. And so I did research on low-carb diets. And while low-carb diets are very popular now, we did extensive research and publishing and on low-carb diets and how people like Robert Atkins and other low-carb diet advocates were being villainized and lied about in the press. That low-carb diets and things like the Paleolithic diet worked. And what I saw, you don't see it as much today, but I literally saw 15, 20 years ago, there was like this establishment already on the internet where if you were questioning standard dietary advice, like USDA dietary advice, people would come after you and would start calling you an evil person. And, eventually it even became apparent some of them were people working for advocates for the government's position. And that seemed weird, but I started seeing it, and how even in the area of human diet and how you should eat, there was a politically correct position, and if you took the wrong position, they said you were dangerous. Like literally, it's not a big deal now. People do keto diets all the time, but when I was writing about it, they were talking about me like I was trying to kill people, and I was going to die soon because I was eating at the time the Robert Atkins diet, which is a perfectly okay diet for some people. Some people it doesn't agree with them, but it's a very healthy diet. And I learned and I wrote and exposed a lot on diet. I never claimed I was a diet expert, just I was showing what was wrong with standard dietary advice and the bad science there. And I would write about the climate change issue and show people based on all this work that the whole climate change, CO2, global warming thing was garbage. I know I've said a lot here, but I don't know. I haven't gotten to even to everything we did, but Dean's World was a really big deal. And then when we shut it down, long story as to why, basically my physical and mental collapse. I, for several years, got into men's rights activism. I was the managing editor at A Voice for Men, and you see me in the movie called The Red Pill. I took all my knowledge and all my contacts and everything I had learned and all my chutzpah from Dean's World, and I brought it to the men's rights movement. I helped see a pretty good movie get made, although it got censored, and did a lot of good work. I'm not proud of everything I did at A Voice for Men or all the people I worked with, but that was pretty great, and we changed the world. I believe we did. And then since then, probably was best known for taking on the Atheist Collective, because I'm a former atheist, and I don't make it my own business to run around trying to make people not be atheists so much as I saw atheism as an ideological cult movement and an intolerant, often, terrible harassers on the internet. And I decided we needed to take them on. By the way, I've even done real groundbreaking research there, interviewing a lot of very interesting people, including Borden Painter and more than one scientist. And I like to talk to interesting people. I've been writing and doing activism work on the internet for most of my life at this point. So that's who I am.
Well, Max, I think that that's something we have in common. We both like talking to interesting people.
Mm-hmm.
And and I'd say that with all that, I mean, that's a lot of interesting things. Where do we even start with that? So, by the way, you mentioned earlier before we got on that there was internet archives of Dean's World and Dangerous Thoughts.
I don't know if Dangerous Thoughts is still out there because that goes back to the 90s. We'd have to look hard for it because that was hanging off of an old ISP I used to be on. But I'll give you a link here to. In fact, here I will share my screen and then I'll send you links later. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. And let's see there. I had some links out here. I remember watching them just try to. I got people try to destroy my reputation and say I was trying to kill people for saying that this diet from Dr. Atkins works okay for some people. That was just one of my discoveries. Here, if you go on the Internet Wayback Machine, I picked something from the 2004 era at random. Everything on that blog's not there, but here is a piece written by. Actually, it's written by Joe Gandelman, who's still out there running the Moderate Voice. He used to work for the Christian Science Monitor. He's a pretty well-known touring comedian, and he runs the Moderate Voice. There's a piece by him. We had, and we had a few ads in those days. We had supported Bush more or less, although even in those years, when we were it was always tempered, and we always had Democrats on the side. In fact, we had some famous Democrats and anti-Bush people writing for us too. Like Aziz Poonawala, not a big fan of that guy anymore, but whatever. Michael Totten used to write for us. Aziz Poonawala used to write for us. G. Willow Wilson, a semi-famous comic book author, wrote for us. We were kind of a big deal back in the day. It doesn't look like much now. Sometimes I look at it and I have regrets, including that I didn't try to keep it going just because we had such a big audience, but very few bloggers from that era survived without having to sell out to some corporate power. So we were truly independent, and that's what did us in. So, are you still there? Oh, did I lose you? Where did you go? Hello? Did Geoconservative, did you leave? Conservative, did you leave? Oh.
Yes, I'm so sorry. You didn't even notice. My internet crashed.
So it's quite all right. It's quite all right. Are you still recording? Are we still recording?
Yes, because you saved the stream because you kept talking.
Oh, all right. As long as it's still recording, then good. All right, everybody. We had a little glitch there, and so I just kept talking, and I'm pretty good at talking. So I forgot what I was saying there, but yeah, there's a screenshot of the old blog. You can find others just look for deanesme.com. Literally, by the way, I'll tell you, this blog was called Dean's World, which we made a joke out of because it was an early blog, a very early blog, one of the world's first. And a friend bought me the domain and installed the blogging software and said, here. And I had no idea it was going to get big. If I had it to do over again, I would not have ever used my name. Dean Esme. I would never have used it. First, because I've always hated the name Dean. Second, I didn't want to be that public. But, a good friend bought it for me, and I had so much fun, and I just kept it simple, and I kept the dumb name. And it became doubly funny because over the years, we get more and more traffic. I mean, we were doing tens of thousands a day of visitors. We were really heavily read. I would tell people Dean's World is dumb. That just sounds like an idiot, Wayne's World reference. I would tell the other contributors and the readers we need to change it. And they're like, no, we like it. So, it became a running joke after a while. And I was like, well, it's just Dean's world. You have to live in it, or whatever, it's my world. I get to assert reality, right? It was just a standing joke. But yeah, that's kind of what we'll look for. There's one of our, if you look through the Wayback Machine, you'll find others. I really wish we still had archives of this, but I don't. It's all gone. And it's part of another era. This kind of era. I'd like to see it come back, frankly, because blogs were better than anything in social media today.
So, yeah. That is, I mean, there's not a lot I can say to that. I mean, you kind of just blew through a lot of the questions I had. What I'd say, what I'd ask is, I was going to ask you things. What was something you learned from those days? What were some things that you were proud of from those days? But you listed a lot, so I guess maybe what did you learn from those days?
Well, I'll give you something that's worth learning, and that's a good example. Here's something from Conservapedia on something called Rathergate. Now, I don't like that it's on Conservapedia, but it's a good example of a censored story. Notice how Rathergate is mentioned here on Conservapedia starting around September 8th, 2004, when 60 Minutes ran a story. I was a very small group of a group of bloggers who were much more. I was a very, very tiny part of it, but I was a little bitty part of it. It was probably maybe the first time we saw what they now call weaponized autism occurring, because basically a whole lot of us bloggers, again, me, very tiny, much bigger leaders than me in this one, but still, it was called Rathergate. It was a lot like Gamergate for anybody who knows about it, but it was starting in 2004, 2005. Basically, a bunch of us all exposed the fact that Dan Rather of 60 Minutes and CBS News was pushing not just a fake story, but obviously forged fraudulent documents to try to hurt George W. Bush's chance of being reelected. It was very partisan, it was very slanted, and it was very obvious that the material that Dan Rather, 60 Minutes, and CBS News were using were lies. And we all definitively proved that they were using forged materials. And one of the most interesting things to see happen after that, was how partisan it all was, because this was one of those things that kind of made me a Bush supporter, even though in retrospect I regret it. But I was a Bush supporter because I saw things like this. And this was the mainstream media in 2004 clearly lying about a sitting president that they didn't like, and they didn't like him because it was a Republican. And that was so obvious. It was the sort of thing that made me very sympathetic to Bush. But what it also showed me was how much the media will lie, because you can't find, like, if you go look on Wikipedia, you see a little bit of Rathergate as a little bitty conspiracy theory and all lies. That's all the top line spin. Conservapedia is the only one who's got anything looks right about it, which is the story I just gave you is the story I gave you. Glenn Reynolds, the Insta Pundit, and a guy named from running something called Little Green Footballs, Bill Ardolino, and a bunch of others did 99,000 times more work than I did, but I covered it, I watched it, I promoted it, and, had my little inputs now and then. But we then saw how the entire media establishment closed ranks around this story and crushed the stories of the bloggers. There was even a book you could buy that you can't find on Amazon anymore that documented what really happened in Rathergate. I can't even find the book on Amazon anymore. This was probably my first, and I watched over the years as the Rathergate story was just crushed, so that by 2006, 2007, nobody knew about it except those of us who saw it and were part of it. And I think that was where I really started to learn, not only is the entire mainstream media, they will create crafted narratives and close ranks and protect themselves, and they will lie shamelessly, because they absolutely were lying. Although I would say, the other thing I would say from that era is that the Democrats were horrible, shameful liars. Shameful liars, we caught them out so many times just lying. And we caught the mainstream media lie. And the only thing I couldn't see that era was how much Bush was and the Republicans were also lying, because that's a psychological thing we could go into. But the main thing I learned, and which I've learned even more in the subsequent years, is that our press is controlled, and our press will close ranks and will lie about history and will stick their lies for years. They will make stories disappear, and they will make people disappear. The people who run the news are powerful. So that's what I'd say is the main thing I learned.
So when you say make people disappear, do you mean like they'll basically character assassinate them and banish them to obscurity? Because I have a few examples later on.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, I don't think the press often has to actually dispatch assassins. All they have to do is destroy your reputation or blot out your entire side of a story, or just blot you out and not talk about you. And they do it all the time. All the time.
I mean, there is, and this kind of gets into the sort of next topic I wanted to cover besides your interesting past, which is the stuff about conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't mind, I'd like to say a little bit about the conspiracy theories and the like. There was a great book that was written that I recently got my hands on called Conspiracy Theory in America. And it was written by a man named Lance DeHaven Smith, who is a Florida professor of political science. And he talks about the idea of conspiracy theories in America and how that term became pejorative. And he points to three different factors that led to this term, conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist, becoming a pejorative. Because before then, it was actually considered to be a sort of a mainstream view amongst intellectuals to posit theories in which elites might be conspiring and controlling people. In fact, it was actually that sort of view that prompted the American Revolution. You can just read the Declaration of Independence. If something like that was published nowadays, something like that would not be able to be published nowadays. The founding fathers are basically Alex Jones level conspiracy theorists.
Yes, they are. Yes.
Like there was this. I mean, it was a very popular conspiracy in the colonies at the time amongst the colonial elites, but it was a conspiracy theory nonetheless. And it wasn't it. And compared, if I'm being honest, as someone who's looked into the history of this thing, if one were to take a look at the evidence behind it, it's compared to some of the stuff that modern conspiracy theories that I've seen. That particular conspiracy theory had kind of lacking evidence, in my view. But that's sort of beside the point. The point is that this used to be a mainstream point of view, and it was popular amongst intellectuals because of it's sort of there were a lot of Marxists, and Marxists had a lot of Marxists and leftists, and they had these kinds of conflict theories. That sort of gelled nicely with that, an entire class of people, manipulating things.
I tell you, it used to be completely normal in the press and even among like news commentators you might see in the news for people just openly say, so do you think so and so and so and so may have gotten together and lied about this for such and such? Or do you think these two companies and their leaderships may be colluding to such and such? And that was just a normal conversation. And something's hit the culture. I have my theories, but it's hit the culture that you call someone a conspiracy theorist to shut them up, and it works. I have some insight as to where the phrase came from. You said this guy had some explanations.
He points to three different factors. The first factor was a sort of intellectual battle in the university that was happening at this time, between two main views of these sorts of things. The first was on one side was Charles A. Beard. Beard was sort of a lefty type of guy, and he represented the sort of orthodox view at that time, which was that elites could conspire together, and he was a very credentialed mainstream historian, and he was writing stuff about how elites were screwing over the country and have been screwing over the country from the time America was independent all the way to Karl Popper. And in his sort of view, he argued that it'd be implausibly difficult to implement widespread conspiracies given the fallibility of human agents. That's a sort of that, which is like one of the main arguments nowadays. And long story short, Charles Beard and his followers were discredited very much because Beard opposed America's entry into World War II.
And Beard was the guy who believed conspiracy theories were normal, or Beard was the guy who? Okay, yeah.
Karl Popper opposed that idea.
Karl Popper's full of garbage on so many things. Karl Popper's even been poisoned to science. I will say it outright. Popperian falsification has been poisoned to science, and nobody actually does it. But anyway, so the guy's views are interesting. Can I just give mine?
Well, I let you talk a while, but
Go ahead.
There were two other things. The second factor was the influence of this one historian named Richard J. Hofstadter, who wrote a 1964 paper called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." He was Now, Hofstadter was sort of like, he used to be a Marxist, but he got disillusioned by Stalinism, but he remained this hard left anti-capitalist his entire life, and he hated the new right. He had that kind of smug liberal attitude. He hated the new right. He hated the William F. Buckley types. He hated the Barry Goldwater types, and so. During 1964, that was, I believe that was like in the aftermath of the sort of, Barry Goldwater ascendancy. He wrote this paper called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics" that was essentially an attack on straw men. He basically tried to paint the entire anti-communist right as being just a bunch of paranoid nutters, but using these kinds of out there straw man while ignoring the fact that several prominent communists worked for FDR, for instance. And then the third and final factor was the CIA's propaganda campaign post JFK assassination.
Thank you.
Lance DeHaven Smith actually goes into detail about how this came about, but he says that but he felt it, the term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist, this kind of thinking was out there in the culture, in the intelligentsia, fermenting for decades. And then the CIA came about, and after JFK assassination, they said, we're going to tell our people in the media to keep using these arguments, keep using this. And that was what finally pushed the word conspiracy theory to be used as a pejorative exclusively.
Well, and what I would say is that the last part is the most important part, the involvement of the CIA and the FBI, and which also goes further and goes then to Hollywood. Because he's pretty much right about all of this. I know in my own research, this one I can't verify, but I talked to a guy from who'd done some work in Air Force intelligence, and he said, yeah, the Air Force is proud that it invented the term conspiracy theory. Right after we became the Air Force and we were no longer the old Army Air Corps, you go into intel training and they'll tell you in the Air Force intelligence services that, yes, we invented the term conspiracy theorist. And we did it specifically to prevent service members from shutting up. We would call it gossip, we would call it conspiracy theorist, and that would make members of the service shut up. And so that's I can't verify that story, but I find it believable. The story that I can believe is what you just documented, and which numerous other sources have documented, which is that the J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI chief, specifically and explicitly asked the Central Intelligence Agency to do something. And what the Central Intelligence Agency came back with was the term conspiracy theory. Based on what I've heard, I'm guessing they got it from the Air Force intel guys, but whatever. And they said, let's propagate this through the news and our other media. And then before anybody says, well, that's just a big conspiracy theorist, how do you know that is true? Well, we have the documentation that that is true, that he did do that, and that that was what came out. And we also have the documentation from the same era that all of the major news sources that were really close to the CIA and the FBI during those times. There's this cool document you can get called the CIA Family Jewels, which you can search up on the internet, CIA Family Jewels. CIA referred to, Rockefeller and other billionaire-owned newspapers as the Family Jewels, and even had the ownership of Time Life publications, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and that, had regular meetings with them, had secret awards ceremonies where the CIA thanked these news leaders. I didn't know all this 10, 15 years ago. I've only learned it in the last few years, but no, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency has been had its fingers deep in all of our news media, all of our lives. And that has been completely illegal, or was completely illegal until 2012, 2013. And so I used to know that it was illegal, so I figured CIA doesn't do that. Well, we know now that CIA was doing that and has never stopped doing it since the day CIA started. They never stopped propagandizing the American public. They never have. And around 2012, 2013, it became completely illegal for them to do it. So maybe it's better now because it's completely legal. And in fact, if you look, it's shocking how many prominent news reporters just tout their CIA connections now, or their FBI connections. That used to be unthinkable and unheard of because the CIA hid the fact that it was doing it. But we also know now, and we can give tons of examples, the way CIA makes you a reporter and controls the press is real simple. A, friendly relationship with media ownership. And B, here's what you do. You identify through psychological profiling and recruiting, promising young people who want to be reporters, who will also be of the psychological type to do whatever CIA wants. And then CIA gets you a job as a reporter. And you get to be an award-winning reporter for the CIA your whole life. And you don't even hear from the CIA very often. They just give you stories that you often win awards for because they gave them to you. And otherwise, you just make sure you get drops, you get notices, you get whatever. This is what the party line is going to be. These are the stories we want you to cover. These are the stories we want you not to cover. And we know now that there have been agents like that in newsrooms all across America for most of the last century. Deal with it. We live in a very controlled media environment. And I think that more than anything is why the term conspiracy theory is now everywhere and used as a pejorative for everything, because the people running our central intelligence, aka what President Trump calls the deep state, they're panicking and they're applying the term conspiracy theory to everything they don't like. And the problem with that is once you start applying the word conspiracy theory to everything you don't like, people are going to start thinking conspiracy theories are a thing again, which is good because conspiracy theories are real. I know there's one you wanted to ask me about, so let me know, because we should talk about the AIDS and the coronavirus thing before we're done.
Oh, yes. So you mentioned before that you investigated some drug companies, and you also got to witness firsthand the sort of AIDS epidemic. Could you explain to me, when was this and what happened then?
Well, the work I did was on the Dean's World blog, and it was from about, I can't remember the years we started, from about 2003, about 2006 or 7, probably before. But I was interested in the issue because I had already seen how there was fake fraudulent science being pushed by the USDA. Because, you know, the food pyramid is deadly for most people, for quite a few people. And then I started doing research and looking. Other people were covering it better, but the climate change thing, the more you looked at it, the more you knew these people were lying about global warming, period. And then, you know, like I said, I had a lot of scientists hanging out, and I don't remember what caused me to become interested in the AIDS issue at all. I was very pro-gay rights during these days. I was very pro-LGBT. I was an atheist. But I had this crusading journalist, I'm going to win the world for truth attitude. You know, what's true? I loved science very, very much, and scientists were my favorite people to hang out with. I hung out with a lot of PhDs, level sciences, and a lot of sciences. And somehow it just came. I don't remember how it came to my attention, but, you know, like, there's something wrong in the stuff they're telling us on AIDS. Oh, I do kind of remember now. Actually, I had a previous interest in it. That's right. Before I was even running the blog, I forgot. I had read a book. I'd read some articles in some political magazines questioning the whole AIDS thing, which was hugely hyped when I was young, especially in the 80s and 90s. I'd read some articles in some magazines questioning that HIV/AIDS science and saying that there were things wrong with it. And it was obvious that there was some political correctness at the time hiding behind the whole AIDS thing, because it was true then, especially, although it's still largely true now, more so than people think, but it was then especially, it was overwhelmingly associated not just with a virus, but with poor lifestyle choices. And just saying that AIDS is associated with poor lifestyle choices got people destroyed in the press. And so at some point in my eyes turned, and I thought, I remembered I had read about this in the years before. I said, yeah, I want to start writing about this now. There seems to be some problems in the science they're reporting here. Like, especially at that time, basically AIDS was only gay guys and poor black people. By the way, if you look into it now, it's still pretty much the same way. Mostly just gay guys and black people, poor black people. We could go into why some other time, but that was one of the flags that I started noticing then. And because Dean's World was famous, some real scientists started showing up. Some really giving me a hard time, but then the ones giving me a hard time routinely were giving poor arguments and poor reasoning and poor evidence. And AIDS dissident doctor, I mean, I made a point to speak only to people with PhDs or MDs, or, you know, people with some otherwise real credibility during that era. Most of the AIDS journalists I talked to, like I said, Celia Farber obviously is just a reporter, but she is somebody who, you can find her book on Amazon, although her book was terribly censored. It was destroyed, you know, reputationally. How can I bring that up for you? It was like Borden Painter's book. Probably people listening probably don't know what I mean, but he's a historian I interviewed. Very famous one, very important one, who got censored. But here's my friend Celia Farber's book, Serious Adverse Events and Uncensored History of AIDS. You notice you have to pay like $60 to get a copy of this paperback, and a hardback is worth nearly $1,000. And that's because it was intentionally scuttled by the publisher. And it's because it lays out all the things wrong in AIDS science. And if I were to give you a short summary of what was wrong, especially in the 80s and 90s with the AIDS science, which was surprising. They had managed to isolate it to reasonable standards in some patients, that the virus was there. Although one of the things that's interesting about it is that of the first AIDS patients that they tested for the virus, they only found that virus called HIV in a little over half those patients. So they're all dying of the same apparent symptoms. They all look identical, but they only found it in a little more than half of it. But because they were able to say it was in a majority of AIDS cases had this virus, They just sort of asserted from there, well, the others, our testing is not as good as it could be, so it's probably in the others too. Literally, this is what people like Robert Gallo were doing at the National Institutes of Health back in the early 80s. Robert Gallo is the man credited with discovering the AIDS virus. I just told you what his work was. He found it in a little over half the original AIDS patients, and that's all he found. But he was well politically connected. I have no evidence at all that he was ever tied to the CIA. We never talked about the CIA. In fact, we used to make fun of people. During these days, these world days, we made fun of people who suggested that CIA might have anything to do with it. All we did is look at the science. And what we eventually found was this. And maybe something has changed in the last 10 years. I kind of doubt it, but maybe something has changed. Here's what we found. First, none of the popular tests to test for the HIV virus were reliable. The original test was something called an antibody test, known as the Western blot test for a lot of years. I don't even know if it's still around. It was a basic, simple antibody test. Because what they were telling us at the time was this virus is super hard to isolate. It's easier to look for the antibody. The antibody being what supposedly kills the virus. Your body has an immune response and creates an immune response. And they had this long, convoluted thing where if you had the antibody, while that would normally make you immune, the way AIDS works, it actually didn't make you immune. So there was already some weird science happening there. It's like, really, the antibody that shows you are immune to the virus is actually what proves you're sick and have the virus. That's kind of where that sort of dodgy side started. They just started saying, yeah, you have the virus because you have the antibody. And the antibody tests are really unreliable. They still are, by the way, for other viruses too. Antibody tests are really unreliable because, number one, they're looking for the antibody, which indicates you've already got some level of immunity, but all they're testing for is that antibody. Second, antibody tests tend to cross-react with a whole bunch of other genetic material that might be in your system that are not that antibody, that are not that virus. They can be antibodies to other things, and they can even cross-react to things like alcohol, which means those tests, those antibody tests, not reliable in any way. And in fact, among the early AIDS researchers and activists who were trying to expose the fact that there were problems with those tests, more than once they had parties where a bunch of researchers would take like 100 of these tests and then you would just sit around testing each other to see if anybody had AIDS. And, they'd do it in a party and they make everybody come up positive, everybody come up negative, and everybody come up inconclusive because the tests don't work. Okay? And what they also exposed is during these 80s and 90s period is that the main drug that they pushed out to treat the AIDS patients was extraordinarily toxic and used at way too high a level. How can I say that these things are both false, are both true? Because right now the AIDS establishment will tell you, A, it would be medical malpractice to use that Western blot test because it's not reliable. Nobody uses it in the Western world anymore. It's totally not reliable and everybody admits it. And it gives lots of false positives, which is why. B, everybody admits the dosages of the AZT they were giving out in the 80s and 90s were lethal. So add those two together. Unreliable tests with a really high false positive rate rolled out to millions of people, and an experimental drug to treat it that turns out if you take it in high enough doses kills you within a year. That's actually what happened. That's what we found. The tests were no good. The drugs were overprescribed and way dangerous, and the tests were no good. And the statistics were as postmodern as anything in global warming, so-called science. And all I can tell you about this is a couple things. I was working with lawyers like David Steele. I went with a court order and a lawyer into GlaxoSmithKline's headquarters in Virginia to get materials in their science labs that they didn't want people to see. That's how far I'd worked on the AIDS issue. I worked with a man who was the world's first molecular biologist. I worked with reporters who had worked for places like CNN and Rolling Stone and Esquire and Harper's. I was working with MDs, including I was talking to biochemists. Literally all the AIDS science in the 80s and 90s was garbage based on just slipshod diagnostic standards, lousy tests, and hysteria. And really not very responsible drugs that got released by the FDA. Now, I could go into why things are better but still not good on the AIDS department. They did clean some stuff up so the whole HIV/AIDS debacle today is not as awful quite. But it was huge postmodern science. And I'll just tell you two things. One, I see all the same mistakes, all the same rushing, all the same hysteria, like almost like they're running the playbook from AIDS in the 80s over again. And that's not paranoia. I'm just saying it's shocking how it looks like that. Because then other people I've talked to who were there in those days are like, this is spooky. It's like they're doing all the same things. And
maybe that's because it's the same people running things.
Actually, if you look at it, guess who's running it? A man named Anthony Fauci in the United States. Anthony Fauci made his bones as the AIDS czar under Reagan. He's still there. He's still the main guy in charge of infectious disease. He bungled the AIDS crisis completely, and he's still there. So yeah, I'm just a little upset when I look at what's going on with this, because the hysteria is going, and the treatment is going to kill more people than the infection, because that's what happened in the 90s already. I won't even go into Africa and what you've read about AIDS in Africa, except I'll tell you this. The tests that would be considered malpractice to use today in the United States or Europe were the tests used on millions of Black Africans to give you your statistics of millions of AIDS patients. Furthermore, the drugs those Black Africans were given are also not drugs typically given in those doses to anybody in America and the United States at those levels. I really don't even want to say more, except I really get twitchy when someone talks to me about AIDS and condescends to me, because this wasn't a conspiracy theory, or at least we didn't think it was. We thought we had uncovered massive medical malpractice and fraud by incompetence and corrupt people. But this was the last thing I learned. And I can document this for anybody who really wants to. Nobody's ever challenged me, but I can. We can show all kinds of documentation. People from something called the Skeptics Network were hired to smear and destroy all of our reputations. All of my so-called AIDS denialist friends had their lives and reputations permanently ruined and smeared, followed around. If you look up online and you Google up AIDS denialism, you'll find lots of articles, including maybe even with my name on them, a few. And it's all smear pieces. It's all hit pieces. And it mostly sources out of people who call themselves skeptics and defenders of science. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, that's where I am on all this. When I talk about the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, biochemistry, genetics, molecular biology, and by the way, vaccines, it comes from years of talking to some of the smartest people in the world. And Big Pharma came after me and tried to destroy me. That's actually the biggest reason I quit Dean's World. They came after me, and they came after my friends, not just with smearing and personal attacks on the internet either. They came after, they'll hire people to go after you in real life. They'll hire people to spread dirt about you at your work. They'll try to get you fired from your job. They'll do all these things for pay. There's online assassins whose job is to do this sort of thing, and paid political actors whose job is to do this sort of thing. So yeah, when somebody calls me an AIDS denialist, I get very, very angry, because I know what that's all about. We're the people who exposed the fact that the tests were no good, the statistics were postmodern, and that their drugs were overprescribed and killing their patients. They can't even deny that it's true anymore, except that the statute of limitations is done. So all those AIDS men, those people, all those gay men who died in the 80s, who were over-medicated by AZT, their families can't sue. So they can just pretty much admit, well, yeah, the diagnosis was probably questionable and the drug probably killed them. But they don't want to say it out loud, but that's what happened. And so I get really angry over the AIDS issue, because I know a lot of gay guys died that didn't need to, and I'm not happy about that. A whole generation was terrorized by a virus scare, by bad information on the virus. And if you think your government this will be my last thing to say. If you think government is corrupt and incompetent, if you're one of those people who thinks that, I mean, maybe you're a liberal and you don't think that. But if you're a person who thinks the government is corrupt and incompetent, how the hell are you trusting anything coming out of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, or the completely insane World Health Organization, a UN racket? Why does anybody consider anything coming out of these people reliable science? It's not. That's kind of where I'm at on Corona. Now I've said so much, dude, but you let me get it all out. Thank you very much.
Well, I just say, first of all, what I'm going to know is that from somebody who is somewhat skeptical of, the idea that, the coronavirus is completely fake. What you said does not sound like, the straw man AIDS denialism. It just sounds like run of the mill government corruption. There was this virus scare. They didn't know what was happening, so they pretended to know what was happening, and that hurt a lot of people.
Okay, here's what I'll say on coronavirus. Everybody has a different idea of where coronavirus came from and what it is. I never said coronavirus doesn't exist. Although I have called it the coronavirus hoax. So Ron Paul has also called it the coronavirus hoax, and he also did not mean there's no virus. When it comes to, it's the hoax surrounding the virus. When it comes to the science on the virus, I can say this about coronavirus. The last I looked, since the hysteria started, the last I looked, there's only one case of actual isolation of it in a human being by United States forces on an American person. In other words, the U.S. establishment domestically has apparently isolated one case actually of the virus, although it's still unverified the last I talked. Every other case diagnosed in the United States has been using either an antibody test, very much like that Western blotter test for AIDS that I just talked to you about, with a really known high false positive rate. It's on the kit. If you go look at the CDC's own material on there, that it cross-reacts like crazy with a bunch of other things. Or what's called a PCR test. And I don't even want to get into it, but PCR tests for viruses are also dodgy. So what is happening here? They are, and what's happening to the symptoms list? The symptoms list of what gets you coronavirus happens to be a particularly nasty kind of lung infection that actually isn't only caused by coronavirus, that can be caused by other things. So what do you have? Dodgy tests, vague, easy to get wrong diagnostic protocol, and therefore dodgy statistics. You keep hearing all these stories. 4,000 cases identified here. Oh, our first case identified in this county. Well, how did they identify the case of coronavirus? Well, the doctor looked at him and said, looks like coronavirus to me. Oh, plus maybe we have this test that the CDC admits isn't reliable. So it's coronavirus. And then the press runs with confirmed case. This is all postmodern. I literally don't know where this virus is or who has it or what it does. If you think you do, I don't believe you. Because there's reasons to believe it might have been created in a lab as an experimental thing. On the other hand, Nature, which is a big science publication, they're actually corrupt, but whatever. Nature published an article claiming they debunked it and it was natural. Meanwhile, other people I know who are molecular biologists and have backgrounds in genetics too will tell you that don't tell anybody, but there's a real good chance that this quote unquote virus is already in millions of people and has been for many centuries. And most of the people who are testing positive were born with it and they got it from their moms and it's harmless and it doesn't do anything. There's scientists who think that is true. Because a virus is just a strand of genetic material. And they'll all tell you, just because you've isolated a strand of genetic material doesn't mean that strand of genetic material does what you think it does. All you've done is found a strand of genetic material. And guess what? There's thousands, maybe millions of those running through your system now. You have hundreds, thousands, uncounted numbers of quote unquote viruses running through your system right now. Everybody listening to this does. You got antibodies to most of them, or they're just harmless anyway, because they're just strands of genetic material that are junk and don't do much of anything and will probably get flushed out of your system. All of these random things are things that these tests for coronavirus can test positive for, by the way. That's why they have a high cross-reactivity rate. Everybody's got random bits of genetic material running through their blood all the time. Everybody. All the time. And that's all a virus is a specific strand of genetic material. Their tests don't test reliably. I don't know how I can say it over and over again. It's right in all the stories in the press. It's right in all the materials from the CDC. The tests aren't reliable. In fact, what's so funny about the tests from CDC is that they're rolling them out. They are literally, you just have to read the stories, guys. Go past the top lines. Go past the headlines. They're right saying in the test, we're not sure. We're going to take the test blood from you and we're going to evaluate it. We're going to keep a permanent record. And as we learn more about the virus and what it does, we'll probably find more people who have it. It's okay. All I can tell you guys is you keep hearing the word conspiracy theory and you keep thinking, how could all these medical professionals and all these scientists get this one wrong? And I'm not telling you what's going on, right? Maybe this virus is everything they say it is. It doesn't, but they can't prove it. They've got no evidence. They really don't. The tests are no good and the diagnostics protocols are garbage. And you get a confirmed case when a doctor looks and says, yes, I think that's coronavirus. That's how you get your test for coronavirus. Ultimately, it's not reliable. So all the medical professionals are either panicking or really, you're going to have either the doctor who looks at it and is afraid to say, well, it might be coronavirus, but it might be something else. He's going to be afraid to say that because he's under high political pressure not to get this wrong, right? If he says, yes, it's coronavirus, then maybe he's even a hero to his whole department. Where if he says if it's not, he looks like a dangerous nutbag who might be wrong. So every doctor on the ground has more motivation to say yes, coronavirus than no. He just does. And he doesn't have to be conspiring or planning anything. That's how the system is already rigged. He wants to give a positive diagnosis either for the fame or even if he doesn't want to get the positive diagnosis, you look at the symptoms list, you look at the dodgy test, and you go, well, should I say it's not the virus? I can't do that. Just put yourself in the doctor's shoes. Okay, so this requires no conspiring from the doctors to be doing the bad science. Although I know some of them are looking and going, I just coin tossed that diagnosis. I know a lot of them are doing that quietly to themselves. I just coin tossed that. I don't. And again, at the drug companies, nobody selling the tests has any reason to question the tests. So. And none of the politicians have any motivation to question the tests. Okay, so who's selling you the tests? Well, while the FDA and the CDC are, in the mix, the drug companies are selling you the tests. And by the way, they're making a profit on everyone, even though right in the test kits says they're not reliable. But you're all believing. Everybody listening is believing these statistics. I'll just repeat one last time and shut up, off of tests that everybody in the establishment admits are not reliable. And on diagnoses that could be 1,000 other things. And we're destroying the world for it. This is insane. That's where I'm at. You guys can think whatever you want. I'm actually way more afraid of the government than I am the virus. And if I were 85 years old, I'd say the same thing. And by the way, I got some friends in their 70s and 80s who are calling bullshit on this, and I'm glad they are. That's it. I'm done.
Well, that was a mouthful, but it was a great bit of information, really. Where can somebody who wants to verify this sort of information you just shared, where can they find, for instance, like the information about the tests not being reliable?
Okay. I will go back and recommend again, just for the information that goes into even how something this big could be mucked up by a big bureaucracy. Although I don't see how anybody thinks a big bureaucracy, big corporate government bureaucracy can't muck things up. But do read Celia Farber's book, Serious Adverse Events and Uncensored History of AIDS, if you can find it. It's a fabulous book that also goes into how something like this could occur. And second, dude, it's the same old story. Go to the CDC website and read what they say about the test. Read it carefully. Don't read any press releases. Don't read any news reports. Go to the CDC and read the CDC's words about their test. Okay? And then look at other stories that go into the test And instead of believing the headlines or the front page, you know, what they're saying, read carefully. And in most tests, most of the stories, they're soft pedaling it. They are literally saying in every story I've read things like, we're going to give you the test, and then they're going to spend the next few months, maybe even years, evaluating your blood sample to try to make sure that the tests are accurate, because they know the tests aren't. So they're going to have your stuff in a jar. Go to CDC, look at their shit. This is what they're saying. They're going to do. They're just putting a positive spin on it. They're going to keep your genetic material forever. They're going to keep your sample forever. They're going to study it forever. And so at any time, they could actually come back and say, well, no, you didn't have coronavirus at all. Sorry, we were wrong. Or could come back literally years later and say, no, it turns out we're wrong. You're infected, and we have to take measures on you. This is what they're saying. You got to look past the spin. You got to look right at the CDC's own material. These tests, they admit, don't work, are not based on anything reliable at all. And you're all believing them. And why? Because the press is spinning it this way. It's all incompetence and stupidity at best. And I think there are venal people at the top who know. I literally don't know what the virus does, because I got no science that tells me what it does. Somebody bring me some. That's where I'll end there. And I'll send people a few links. I would just otherwise say, you know what? Anybody can be skeptical of anything. Really use your brains and look at this. Even if the virus does what you think it does, their tests are no good. Their statistics are garbage. Period. Tell me I'm wrong.
I'd like to actually show that this kind of hysteria is actually pretty terrifying in a way, because to give a recent example, there was a guy named Vernon Coleman. Max left. Max, where are you? Okay. Sorry, guys, but I just wanted to. Oh, there he is.
Yes.
Sorry, Max.
Just keep going. Yep.
I mean, you were just dropping the mic, and you accidentally shut your thing off, didn't you?
I was stopping. I didn't drop my mic. I was stopping screen sharing and closed the whole window instead. Yeah.
Oh, well, good technology. But here's my screen share. You can see the Vernon Coleman article. As you can see, they're considering it for deletion.
Yes. Vernon Coleman for deletion. Yep.
Yeah, and you're probably thinking, well, who is this guy? I mean, it says he's self-published author, former general practitioner from Britain, written over 100 books. One of his novels became a movie back in the early 2000s. Like, why is he being talked about? Why is he being considered for deletion? Well, he did a thing. Oopsie. And I'll share that. Oopsie. Here. And boom.
Oopsie. Bringing up the video, I'm thinking coronavirus disease, COVID-19. Everybody should see this, and it has been heavily censored all over the internet. And just like Mr. Geocon here is saying, ever since this came out, not only are they heavily censoring it on the internet, but they're now coming out like wolves to destroy him. He had a perfectly good Wikipedia entry. Now they're trying to take him away. And you listen to him talk about this. It's amazing what he says, because he says very clearly in a few minutes everything that was wrong with AIDS science in the 80s and 90s, and how a lot of people got hurt who didn't need to be. He says it perfectly, and then he explains why it's the same thing. And I kind of knew this guy's name before. I never worked with him, but he's saying what a whole lot of people would like to say. And notice what happens. They censor the crap out of you. A whole lot of doctors who have doubts are being silenced. Scientists who have doubts are being silenced. This guy's being silenced. And they're calling you a science denier, a virus denier, a nut job, a conspiracy theorist. And what is Dr. Coleman here saying? He's saying tests are no good. The recommended treatment protocol is highly questionable, and this is dangerous hysteria. What did I say? I said the same thing. So we're nutty conspiracy nuts? No. If you do your research on this stuff, this is bad science. This is as bad as anything you find in climate change. This is ridiculously bad science. And people are going to die because of this bad science. Yeah, I'm just ranting. I'm sorry I took over. But yeah, this is a great deal if you can find it. It got taken down, but if you can find Vernon Coleman on coronavirus disease, hidden agenda, what can I say?
I think you've said I honestly am kind of blown away, actually. It's just I've read several different sources, people like the Distributist and Mencius Moldbug. They have worked in these essays. They have written in these essays about how the corona, about these institutions, and how there's not really, when politics gets involved, there's not really a whole lot of incentive for scientists to do good science and be truthful. There's not the self-correcting mechanism of the scientific method doesn't is just sort of thrown out the window in the face of lots of money and emotions and partisan politics.
Yes.
And and when and Distributist in particular, he did one of his first videos. He did a speech about how if there's any public figures nowadays are incentivized to act like they're certain about everything, that they're confident about everything. Yep. And this is one of the main results of that. If you act confident, if you act like there's no uncertainty, that you're confident on everything, then you're going to end up with a lot of dead people, really, because you'll just promote all this crazy stuff.
And the more I guess I would like to leave, the more we use name calling, classic ad hominem, like simply calling someone a conspiracy theorist simply to make them shut up because you don't like their idea, the worse things get. I mean, I don't know how that's not even obvious. Although I've literally had people tell me I need to be shut up. I've had people I thought were friends that tell me I needed to be shut up. I had one friend who said he thought if I defied a quarantine order, he would not hesitate to shoot me dead. And I'm like, okay, well, the psychological effect of scaring people with viruses is very good. But it's also been very claimed, man, you better be careful if you're going to question it, because this is like watching a house burn down, only people are rushing into it thinking that will fix it somehow. I don't get it. I don't get it. But I wish I could end on something positive, except you know what? I think I would like to end on something positive. I think that while everything the government is doing here is completely irresponsible, because I mean, really, take away everything I just said. Let's assume the science is rock solid. It's still, there's every reason to think what they're doing is going to kill more people than the virus. And if you can't grasp that, you shouldn't be in this conversation, because literally everybody who's scared, nobody wants to talk about what the cost is going to be for getting this one wrong. How many old people are going to die in isolation? How many people are going to die from fear and loneliness? How many people are going to be misdiagnosed because of harassed, harried, and scared doctors? Nobody wants to talk about the cost of getting this wrong on the other side. I think a lot of people are going to die because we got this one wrong and we overreacted to something. But I think maybe more and more people will see the truth. I see more and more people doubting. I see more and more people out on the streets You know, there's even people wearing face masks, but they're saying things like, I only put this on so people won't be afraid of me. I don't believe this crap. I don't know. President Trump is talking hard about trying to end this within a few weeks. People are criticizing him for it, but I hope he does it. I think we need to give up this culture of fear, man. Stop being afraid because the government tells you to be afraid. Stop being afraid because government scientists tell you to be afraid. Stop being afraid because the scientist tells you to be afraid. Get skeptical of everything. Is that a good stopping point? Or
I think that's a great stopping point. Thank you for coming on, Max. Well, we didn't get any comments from the audience today, but please share this video around. A lot being honest about. I'm Mr. Geocon, and we're signing out.
God bless everybody.